The wedding was going perfectly until it was interrupted by a 10-year-old boy. He ran forward and handed a note to the groom, causing everyone to freeze in anticipation when the man opened it and read it, and a shocked silence enveloped the room. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you're watching from. The grand hall shimmered under the glow of an intricate crystal chandelier, its light casting a warm glow across the expanse of polished marble floors, while the scent of fresh roses and jasmine lingered in the air, mingling with the distant notes of a string quartet playing a soft classical melody. Rows of elegantly dressed guests sat in hushed anticipation, their eyes fixed on the beautifully decorated altar where the ceremony was about to take place. White and gold adorned every corner, from the delicate floral arrangements cascading down the aisle to the carefully arranged table settings awaiting the reception. At the center of it all stood John, the groom, his broad shoulders squared and his hands steady as he awaited the moment he had dreamed of for months. His dark navy suit was perfectly tailored, the crisp white of his shirt accentuating the cool blue of his eyes. He was a man of quiet strength, composed, his emotions held in check. Yet those who knew him well could see the way his fingers lightly tapped against his thigh, the only sign of nervous energy beneath his otherwise calm exterior. Beside him stood Sarah, radiant in an ivory wedding gown that hugged her slender frame before flowing down into a soft cascade of silk and lace. Her rich brown skin gleamed under the golden light, her eyes alight with emotion as she held John's hands. The dress, with its intricate embroidery, was chosen not just for its beauty, but for the symbolism woven into every stitch. Her late mother's lace sewn into the hem as a reminder of the past as she stepped into a new future. Yet, just a few feet away, slightly apart from the altar, stood 10-year-old Tyler, dressed in a miniature version of John's suit. His tie, slightly askew from his own impatient adjustments, made him the only one in the room who did not share in the joy that filled the space. His small hands were clenched at his sides, and his dark brown eyes fixed on the floor as he shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, unlike the guests who watched the ceremony with warmth in their gazes. For his expression remained unreadable, a storm of emotions brewing beneath his reserved exterior. The weight of the moment pressed upon him as he had never felt at home in this world of carefully polished appearances where everyone spoke in soft voices and exchanged practiced smiles. His mother had always belonged here, moving effortlessly through spaces filled with poised, graceful people, and her laughter, bright and welcoming. Yet Tyler had always felt like an outsider, a presence that didn't quite fit, like a puzzle piece forced into a place where it didn't belong. Sarah had tried to reassure him over the past months. She had told him that John was a good man, that he cared for both of them, that he wanted to be part of their lives, but words meant little when the fear of being left behind gnawed at his thoughts. His father had once held his mother's hand just like John did, once stood beside her with the same promise of forever, and yet he was gone. Tyler had been too young to understand it when his father had died, but he had felt the loss in every quiet evening his mother spent alone, and in every glance she gave him when she thought he wasn't looking, and in every time she tucked him in at night and whispered, "You'll always have me." But now she wasn't just his anymore. The officiant cleared his throat, drawing the room's attention as he began to speak with a warm voice and carefully chosen words reflecting the significance of the moment. John and Sarah turned to face each other, their hands still entwined. As John's voice was steady when he spoke his vows, he promised to love and cherish Sarah, to support her dreams, and to stand beside her through every challenge life might bring. His words were not rehearsed. They carried the weight of sincerity and a quiet devotion that had built over time, as he spoke not as a man caught up in the grandeur of the occasion, but as someone who had made a choice to love not just in this moment, but in all the days to come. Sarah's gaze softened as she listened, her own emotions brimming as she prepared to speak her vows in return. Her grip on John's hands tightened just slightly, as if grounding herself in the reality of what this day meant. From his place beside them, Tyler barely heard the words as his pulse pounded in his ears and his hands, damp, stared at the small folded paper hidden inside his jacket pocket. He had written it the night before, sitting on his bed, staring at the blank page for what felt like hours before finally picking up his pencil, having thought about keeping it simple. Just one sentence, a question that had taken root in his heart ever since John had entered their lives. Now, as John reached in his pocket and pulled out the wedding band meant for Sarah, Tyler's breath caught in his throat. He knew what came next. The final step, the moment where John would place the ring on his mother's finger, sealing the vow and binding them together in a way that could not be undone. Tyler's fingers curled around the note inside his pocket, feeling the paper crinkle slightly beneath his grip. And then, before he could stop himself or allow doubt to creep in and steal his voice, he took a deep breath and stepped forward with the word "wait" cutting through the hall sharp and sudden, as the music halted and the officiant's words died on his lips. Every head turned in his direction, eyes widening in confusion and shock, while John froze, the ring still held between his fingers. Sarah's brows furrowed, her lips parting slightly as if she wasn't sure she had heard correctly, and Tyler's heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. But he didn't waver. He took another step forward, his hands trembling and his breath shaky. All eyes were on him now, the weight of their gazes pressing down on him. But he didn't look at them. His eyes remained locked on John, the man who stood between him and the fear that had haunted him for months. Slowly and deliberately, he reached into his pocket, pulling out the small folded note. His fingers felt clumsy as he unfolded it, but his resolve didn't falter. The hall remained silent as he extended the paper toward John with his grip tight and his knuckles white. Sarah took a step toward him, her voice barely above a whisper, saying, "Tyler," but he didn't look at her. John hesitated only a second before reaching out and taking the paper from the boy's hand, holding it carefully with an unreadable expression as he began to unfold it. Tyler didn't blink or breathe, for he knew that whatever happened next, whatever words John spoke, and whatever expression crossed his face when he read those few simple words, would change everything. A heavy silence followed Tyler's outburst, thick with confusion and disbelief. The wedding hall, which moments ago had been filled with soft music and warm anticipation, now felt frozen in time. Every guest had turned their attention to the small boy standing at the front, his chest rising and falling with unsteady breaths, his fingers clutching the edges of the paper he had just handed to John. Sarah's lips were slightly parted, her expression caught somewhere between shock and concern, her heart pounding as she tried to process what was happening, while Tyler's voice still echoed in her ears, sharp, urgent. And it was clear that this wasn't a playful interruption or a moment of childish nerves. There was something deeper behind his voice, something that sent a ripple of unease through her. John, who had been moments away from placing the wedding band on Sarah's finger, now stood motionless with the small folded paper resting in his palm. His fingers curled around it, as if the weight of the note had somehow increased since it had passed from Tyler's hand to his. He glanced down at the paper, then back at the boy in front of him, his blue eyes filled with an unreadable expression. Meanwhile, murmurs began in the crowd, hushed whispers weaving through the room. Some guests exchanged puzzled glances, while others craned their necks for a better view. The officiant, who had been presiding over the ceremony with a calm and practiced voice, now stood awkwardly to the side, clearly uncertain of what to do, casting a questioning glance at Sarah, who had no answer to give. Tyler felt the weight of every gaze pressing down on him, but he did not retreat. His small shoulders were squared and his jaw tied, for he had spent too long feeling invisible, too long watching from the sidelines and being unsure of his place in this new life his mother was building. But now, for the first time, he had forced them all to see him. Sarah finally found her voice, though it was softer than she intended, and said, "Tyler," as she took a step toward him. "What are you doing?" Her son didn't look at her. His focus remained solely on John, his hands clenched at his sides, his breath coming in shallow bursts. Sarah felt a twinge of pain at the way he avoided her gaze as John's fingers tightened around the note. He exhaled slowly, as if trying to ground himself before carefully unfolding the paper in a deliberate, almost cautious movement, as if whatever was written inside had the power to alter everything. A single sentence stared back at him in slightly uneven, carefully written letters. "Please adopt me." Those words hit him like a tidal wave, unexpected and overwhelming. His breath caught in his throat, his fingers tightening around the note, as if it might slip away. Sarah's eyes darted between John and Tyler, her heartbeat accelerating as she took another step forward, her voice now laced with worry. "Tyler, this isn't Mom." The boy finally looked at her, his voice quiet but firm, saying, "I'm not joking." She faltered, having never heard him speak with such certainty and quiet intensity before. He wasn't just acting out or trying to embarrass her. He had planned this. John still hadn't spoken, his gaze fixed on the note, as if the words on the page had transported him somewhere else entirely, his mind reeling with memories and emotions colliding all at once. He thought of the first time he had met Tyler, the guarded way the boy had watched him, always assessing and keeping his distance. He remembered the countless small interactions, the mornings when Tyler would sit silently across from him at the breakfast table, and the brief moments when their eyes met across the living room before the boy quickly looked away. He recalled the hesitation in Tyler's voice whenever he addressed John, and the way he had never quite let himself believe that this man, a stranger who was about to marry his mother, could ever be something more. And now, in front of a room full of people, in the middle of the most significant moment of his life, Tyler had asked for something greater than any vow John could have spoken. The boy wasn't afraid of interrupting a wedding. He was afraid of being left behind. John's chest ached with the weight of that realization. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had always tried to be patient, to let Tyler come to him in his own time without pushing too hard. But what if all this time Tyler had simply been waiting for John to prove that he wasn't going anywhere? Sarah's tone, filled with unspoken questions, worry, and something that sounded almost like hope, pulled him back to the present. The note trembled slightly in his grasp as he lifted his head to look at Tyler, who still stood there, bracing himself for whatever answer would come. His eyes were wide, dark pools of uncertainty, but behind them lay something raw and unguarded. He was waiting. John's entire body tensed as emotion surged through him. He had always believed that love was something that grew in slow, steady steps, something that had to be earned over time. But looking at Tyler now, he realized that sometimes love came in a single, defining moment. Without hesitation, he dropped the note to the floor and stepped forward suddenly and unexpectedly. Tyler stiffened slightly, his breath hitching, yet he did not move away. John reached for him, his hands firm but gentle as he pulled the boy into his arms. And in that moment, as Tyler's small frame pressed against him, something shifted inside John, a silent promise sealed in the embrace. At first, Tyler did not react. His body remained tense and uncertain. Then, after a long moment, he slowly lifted his arms and clung to John, his fingers gripping the back of his jacket as though afraid to let go. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, pressing her hand to her mouth as her eyes glistened with unshed tears. A murmur spread through the crowd, confused, touched, overwhelmed, while some guests wiped away their tears and others exchanged stunned glances. No one had expected this. John closed his eyes briefly, pressing his chin lightly against the top of Tyler's head, and when he spoke, his voice was steady but thick with emotion. "You don't even have to ask." The boy did not respond with words. Instead, his grip tightened. Sarah knelt beside them, placing a gentle hand on Tyler's back, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sweetheart." Tyler did not pull away from John. He only turned his head slightly, just enough to glance at her, his dark eyes shining. John slowly pulled back just enough to look at him, his hands still resting on Tyler's shoulders, and the boy met his gaze, searching and waiting for reassurance. John offered a small but firm nod. The message was clear. He was his son now. The wedding was no longer just about a marriage. It had become the moment that forged a family. For a long moment, no one moved. The grand hall, once alive with the gentle murmur of guests and the delicate strains of music, now felt impossibly still as the silence wrapped itself around the room like a thick fog, suffocating the usual warmth a wedding should carry. All eyes remained on John, on Tyler, and on the simple folded piece of paper that now lay discarded at their feet. The note had been read, its message absorbed, yet the weight of it lingered in the air like an unspoken promise waiting for acknowledgement. Sarah's hands trembled at her sides, and her breath came shallow as she tried to grasp the reality of what had just unfolded before her. She had always known that Tyler struggled with change, that he had been wary of John's presence in their lives, but never had she imagined that this was the storm brewing behind his guarded expressions, his quiet distance, his watchful eyes. He had been carrying this fear, this longing, all on his own, waiting for the right moment to make himself heard. John remained unmoving, his face unreadable beneath the tension that held his small frame rigid, his hands hanging at his sides, his fingers curled slightly as if bracing for rejection, for misunderstanding, for the possibility that even now, after exposing himself so vulnerably, he might not receive the answer he needed. He had prepared himself for the worst. Still crouched slightly after embracing the boy, John remained close, his steady hands still resting on Tyler's shoulders. His face, which had carried quiet composure throughout the ceremony, now held something different, an unguarded, raw emotion that softened the sharp lines of his expression. The note had said so little, but those few words had unraveled something deep within him, something he hadn't fully realized until now. The room remained frozen in expectation, waiting for someone, anyone, to speak. Sarah was the first to move, though her steps were hesitant as she knelt beside them. The lace of her wedding dress pooling around her and her fingers brushing lightly against Tyler's back. The boy stiffened slightly at her touch, but did not pull away. He was still staring at John, his expression unchanging, waiting. John finally exhaled slowly and measuredly, as if steadying himself for something far greater than any marriage vow, and reached down carefully to pick up the discarded note from the floor. His thumb brushed over the slightly creased edges. Though the handwriting was small and uneven in places, the meaning it carried was immeasurable. He read it again and again silently, even though the words were already burned into his mind. Please adopt me. John had always believed that actions spoke louder than words, that love was something built over time and earned through patience and care. He'd spent months trying to show Tyler, in small ways, that he wasn't going anywhere, that he wanted to be there not just for Sarah, but for him. He had never expected the boy to ask for this so directly, to reach out in a way that was so undeniably honest. It was rare to witness such raw vulnerability, especially from someone so young. With deliberate care, he folded the note, slipping it into the pocket of his suit before meeting Tyler's gaze. The boy's eyes, usually so guarded and reluctant to reveal anything, were now wide with a look that John recognized for what it truly was: hope. Fragile and uncertain, yet hope nonetheless. John said at last in a quiet but firm voice, carrying the weight of truth, "This means everything to me." "You mean everything to me?" Tyler did not move or speak. He only stared at him, waiting for more reassurance. Sarah's hand found Tyler's as her fingers curled around it gently. Her heart ached at the sight of him standing there so small, so lost in a room full of people who loved him but whom he had never quite trusted to stay. She had always thought that she was enough, that her love would be all he needed, but love was complicated. It wasn't just about feeling wanted, it was about feeling safe. John shifted slightly lower, so that he was now at Tyler's eye level. He did not reach for him this time, or try to force comfort where it hadn't yet been accepted. Instead, he spoke with quiet certainty. "I would be honored to be your father." For a moment, something flickered in Tyler's expression so quick and so subtle that Sarah almost missed it. It wasn't a smile or even relief, but rather the smallest, faintest release of tension from his shoulders, as if a weight he had been carrying for far too long had lessened, even if only slightly. The murmur in the hall grew louder as the guests slowly began to process what they had just witnessed. Some whispered in hushed, emotional tones, while others simply watched, knowing they had been part of something far more significant than a wedding ceremony. Sarah glanced at Tyler once more. When she saw no resistance in his face, she turned back to John with a slow, trembling smile. "Are we okay?" she asked softly, searching his face for any sign of regret. Tyler swallowed his throat tight and finally gave a small nod as John squeezed his hand gently. And for the first time that day, Tyler squeezed back. The officiant, who had remained respectfully silent throughout the exchange, finally stepped forward and cleared his throat lightly, saying, "If we are ready to continue," in a voice carrying no impatience but only quiet understanding. Sarah glanced at Tyler once more, and when she saw no resistance in his face, she turned back to John with a slow, trembling smile. John lifted the wedding band once again, and this time, as he slid it on Sarah's finger, he knew that this moment, this union, was not just about him and the woman he loved. It was about the boy standing beside them, the family they were building together, and the life that was just beginning. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the applause that erupted through the hall was not just for their marriage, but for something far greater. Tyler did not let go of John's hand, not once. Even as the applause still lingered in the air, a wave of sound filling the wedding hall and pressing against the walls. Guests rose from their seats, some smiling and others wiping at the corners of their eyes, caught in the depth of what they had just witnessed. This was no ordinary wedding. This was something different, something deeper. The union between John and Sarah had just taken place, but another bond had also been formed in that very moment. A bond between a man and a boy who had both been waiting in their own ways for a family to feel complete. John barely registered the noise around him. He could still feel the weight of Tyler's small hand in his own, the slight but significant pressure of the boy's fingers holding on as if he were still afraid to let go. There had been no hesitation in that grasp, no second-guessing. Tyler had asked for something with all the courage he had ever mustered, opening himself in a way that few children his age would dare to. And John had answered in the only way he could, with complete certainty. Sarah stood close, her fingers still trembling slightly from the intensity of the moment, her heart swelling with emotion as she looked at John and Tyler together, side by side, as though an unspoken understanding had settled between them, something deeper than words that could not be undone. Tyler had barely moved. His face remained carefully neutral, his dark eyes locked on a single spot on the floor, as if trying to process what had just happened. There was tension in his small shoulders, the kind that comes from years of guarding oneself and never quite believing that good things could stay. John turned slightly, lowering himself just enough to be at Tyler's eye level again. The movement was slow and careful, giving the boy space. Tyler still hadn't spoken since those 3 words had left his lips, and since his world had shifted in a way he hadn't expected. His breathing was still shallow, his hands twitching slightly at his sides. John didn't force anything. He only looked at him steadily and patiently and asked simply, "You okay?" Though the question was simple, Tyler's lips pressed into a tight line as his throat moved while he swallowed. Sarah watched the exchange with careful eyes, noticing how Tyler held something back, how emotion trembled just beneath his skin. He was so young, yet he had spent so much time learning to hide his feelings, keeping them locked away where no one could reach them. And then, suddenly, something cracked, the smallest trembling of his lower lip. The way his fingers curled just slightly against the fabric of his suit, it was enough to send a single tear slipping down his cheek before he could stop it. In that moment, he stiffened his hands immediately as if to wipe it away before anyone could see. But John had already seen, and Sarah had seen, and before Tyler could retreat back into himself, John reached out slowly and carefully, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Tyler sucked in a sharp breath, his whole body rigid, his small fingers still hovering in the air as though unsure what to do. Another tear followed the first, silent and unbidden, and Sarah felt something inside her tighten at the sight of it. Then, without warning, Tyler moved, not dramatically or suddenly, but in a small, almost hesitant half-step forward as he pressed his forehead lightly against John's chest. Not quite a hug, but just enough contact to feel he wasn't alone. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. John did not react immediately. He let Tyler dictate the pace of the moment, allowing him to decide how much he could handle, how much he was willing to give. Finally, John raised a hand and gently rested it on the back of the boy's head, his fingers barely brushing through Tyler's tight curls. The embrace was neither forced nor overwhelming. It simply was there. Tyler did not move for a long time. His small body shook slightly, but he did not step away or speak, while Sarah reached out carefully, her hand finding its way to Tyler's back to offer warmth and reassurance. The wedding had long since ceased to be just about the ceremony. It had become something else entirely. The guests, sensing the significance of the moment, grew quiet again. Many had tears in their eyes as they witnessed something far greater than they had expected. This was no longer just about a marriage. It was about a child finding a place where he belonged. After what felt like a small eternity, Tyler finally took a step back. His face was streaked with tears and his breath still shaky, but there was something different in his eyes, something lighter. Sarah quickly wiped her own eyes, smiling at him through the blur of emotion, and softly asked, "You sure you're okay?" Tyler nodded, though his voice still wasn't steady enough to speak. John studied him for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded note once again. He turned it over in his fingers before crouching slightly to meet Tyler's gaze and said, "I'm keeping this. This is the most important thing anyone's ever given me." Tyler stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether or not he believed him. Then, without a word, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Sarah felt her heart swell as the warmth of the moment settled over her like a soft embrace. This wasn't how she had imagined her wedding day going, not the perfect, seamless celebration she had planned, but perhaps perfection was not measured solely by appearances. The rest of the ceremony continued, though the atmosphere had changed. There was something new in the air, something unbreakable as they moved forward. As John finally slipped the ring on his Sarah's finger and they sealed their vows with a quiet kiss, Tyler remained at John's side, never letting go of his hand even after the wedding had ended, the weight of what had happened still lingering in the air. The guests moved to the reception hall, where soft music played and glasses clinked in quiet celebration. Laughter and murmured conversations filled the space, yet there was an unspoken understanding among them that tonight had been about more than two people uniting in marriage. It was about something deeper. Tyler sat at one of the small round tables, his plate barely touched, while the adults moved with ease, their smiles warm, their laughter flowing naturally. He could hear John's voice somewhere nearby, deep and even, carrying a reassurance that Tyler could not yet name. Sarah was speaking to a relative, her eyes still carrying the quiet glow of a bride, though her gaze often flickered to Tyler as if checking on him. Tyler pushed a small piece of cake around his plate with his fork. The sweetness still lingered in his mouth despite having only taken a single bite. He should have felt relief, something easier now that he had spoken the words that had sat heavy on his chest for so long. But instead he felt exposed. Even though John had said the right things and meant them, Tyler could not shake the feeling that he had asked for too much, that he had taken something that was not meant to be his. He had spent most of his life keeping himself small, learning young that asking for too much led to disappointment. His father had died when he was 3. He had no memories of him except the stories his mother told, the faded pictures in the old photo album on the shelf, and a vague recollection of a warm voice that may have only existed in dreams. His mother had tried her best to keep that presence alive for him, to make him feel as if he had not lost something crucial. But Tyler had always felt the absence in ways he could not explain. Other kids in his class would talk about their fathers, about weekend fishing trips, baseball games, and the strong hands that guided them when they were uncertain, while Tyler listened in silence, staring down at his desk, waiting for the conversation to move on. It was not that he was ashamed, only that he did not know how to explain what it was like to grow up with only the echoes of a father rather than the man himself. For a long time, it had been just him and his mother, and that had been enough, or at least he had convinced himself it was, until John had entered their lives. Tyler had not known what to do with him. The man was steady and present, never forcing himself into Tyler's world, always staying at the edges, waiting, and perhaps that was what had made it worse. John had given him the space to decide, and Tyler had spent months fighting with himself over what the decision should be, wondering what if he let himself believe John was here to stay. What if he let himself believe that John truly wanted him? And what if, just like his father, John was taken away? Tyler had spent so long pretending that it didn't matter, that it was fine if John was only a man's husband and not his father. He had buried the jealousy he felt when he saw John doing small things for his mother, bringing her coffee in the morning, pulling her into an absent-minded embrace as she walked by. He had swallowed down the tight feeling in his chest whenever John offered him the same kindnesses, a steady hand on his shoulder, a quiet acknowledgement of his presence, an open invitation rather than a demand. And when the wedding had arrived, Tyler was forced to face the truth. John was not the enemy. John had never been the enemy. The enemy had been Tyler's own fear, his own belief that he would never be enough for someone to want to keep him. He had written the note the night before the wedding, his hand shaking as he pressed the pencil to paper, rewriting it 4 times, each time staring at the words and wondering if he was making a mistake. He had tucked it into the pocket of his small suit jacket that morning, promising himself that he wouldn't give it to John, that it was stupid and childish to want something so badly. But then, standing in that wedding hall watching John slide the ring onto Sarah's finger, Tyler had felt something break inside him. It had been his last chance to say what he had never been able to say. Please adopt me. He hadn't expected anything from it. Maybe a quiet rejection, a gentle explanation of why things couldn't be as he wanted them to be, maybe a moment of discomfort or a reminder that he was still just a child asking for things he didn't deserve. But John had not rejected him. John had not hesitated. And yet, as Tyler sat at the table with the noise of the reception swirling around him and the uneaten cake forgotten, a shadow fell over him as he wondered what if John had only said it because of the wedding, because it had been a public moment with people watching, and what if when the celebration ended and the guests went home, John realized he had spoken too soon. Tyler's fingers curled into his lap, the uneaten cake now forgotten, as he looked up to see John standing there holding a small plate of food. His suit jacket was gone now, his sleeves rolled up, making him seem less like the distant adult Tyler had once thought him to be and more like someone who belonged here. "Hey, John," Tyler said as he sat down across from him and set his plate down with an easy movement. "Not hungry." Tyler hesitated, then shook his head. John didn't push him. He only nodded, picking up his fork and taking a few bites of his own food, as if to say, "I'll sit here with you no matter how long it takes." Tyler stared at the table, his fingers twisting together in his lap, his mind a tangled mess of thoughts and emotions too big for him to sort through. He wanted to ask a question, but his throat was tight and his chest heavy, though John was patient, as Tyler had learned about him over time. After a long silence, when the words finally came, they were small and uncertain. "Did you mean it?" John didn't pretend not to understand. He set his fork down and leaned forward slightly, his expression open as he said, "Yeah, I did." Tyler's breath hitched slightly, his fingers twisting tighter as he whispered, "You don't have to if you don't really want to." John exhaled, leaning his arms on the table, and said in a steady voice, "Tyler, I don't say things I don't mean. I wouldn't have said it if I wasn't sure." Tyler swallowed hard, his heart pounding, even if he wasn't entirely sure himself. He stopped himself before he could say the word enough, but John heard it anyway. John's expression softened further as he leaned forward and said, "You are. You always were." And for the first time that night, for the first time in a long time, Tyler let himself believe it. The evening carried on, filled with music and celebration. Yet Tyler still felt as though he were on the edge of it all, watching from a place just beyond reach, even as John's words settled into his chest, letting him believe, if only a little, that maybe things could be different now. The part of him that had spent years guarding his heart remained wary, for he had spent so long pretending that nothing mattered, convincing himself that he didn't need John and that his mother's love was enough. But deep down, in a place he had long refused to acknowledge, he had always been afraid that one day she wouldn't be just his anymore. And now that day had come. Sarah was married, John was here, and Tyler, for all his uncertainty, had asked for something he had never dared to before. "Please adopt me." The words echoed in his mind, their weight still heavy even though John had already given him an answer. I would be honored to be your father." The sentence had been so simple. No hesitation, no doubt, but Tyler had learned long ago that words are not always promises, that people might say things in the moment and later realize they hadn't really meant them. What if John woke up tomorrow and regretted it? What if everything changed again? Tyler sat quietly, picking at the fabric of his pants, his mind a storm of thoughts he couldn't control. He barely noticed as guests came and went, as Sarah moved through the room greeting family and friends. She kept looking over at him, her eyes warm with quiet concern, yet she didn't push, perhaps knowing that pushing would only make him retreat further. And then there was John. Tyler had expected him to return to the adults, to fade into the space where people like him belonged, laughing, talking, sharing drinks and toasts, but John stayed close. He never hovered or made it seem as if he was forcing himself into Tyler's space, but he remained at the same table, occasionally offering a quiet comment or a simple glance, as if to remind Tyler that he wasn't alone. It wasn't until much later, when most of the guests had begun to filter out, that Tyler finally found the courage to speak. The reception hall had quieted, the music softer, the atmosphere slower and calmer. Sarah was across the room, talking with her sister, and the few remaining guests were saying their goodbyes. Tyler sat at the table, his hands folded in his lap, his thoughts still tangled, but his heart beating with something that felt almost like resolve. He turned to John and asked, "Are you really going to do it?" John, who had been sipping from a glass of water, set it down carefully and said, "Do what?" Tyler swallowed, his fingers curling against his palm, and said, "Adopt me." John didn't look surprised by the question. He didn't rush to answer or say something just to fill the silence. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped in front of him, and said, "Yeah, if that's what you want." Tyler frowned. "I already told you I wanted it." John replied, "I know, but I want to make sure you know that I do too." Tyler looked down at his lap, his chest tight. The part of him that had always braced for disappointment, that had always expected to be let down, still whispered warnings in the back of his mind. But the way John spoke, the way he didn't rush or try to convince him of anything, made it seem as if this time it was real. John leaned back in his chair, watching Tyler carefully, and said, "It's a big decision for both of us." Tyler's throat felt dry as he asked, "Are you sure you want me?" John didn't hesitate, replying, "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." His answer so certain and simple that Tyler didn't know how to respond. His fingers tightened in his lap, and, for a moment, he felt something sharp rise in his chest, something that made it hard to breathe. But then, before he could stop himself or let doubt take hold again, he whispered, "Okay." John's lips curved into a small, quiet smile. He didn't make a big deal of it or act as if this were some grand moment. He simply nodded as if it had always been a given, as if he had never once doubted that this was where they were meant to end up. Tyler exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was just acceptance, and for the first time he let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, John wasn't going anywhere. As the night grew quieter and the echoes of music and conversation faded into a softer hum, the last of the guests began to leave the grand hall, a place that had been filled with laughter and celebration only hours before, now carrying a different kind of energy, something gentler and unspoken. The wedding had been beautiful, the kind of event people would remember not just for its elegance, but for what had unfolded within it. As the remaining guests lingered in quiet groups, exchanging farewells and final toasts, it was clear that the ceremony itself had not been the most unforgettable part of the evening. Near the exit, Sarah stood with her sister, their voices low as they spoke, though she had spent most of the night engaged in conversation, her mind never drifting far from Tyler. She had watched him carefully throughout the evening, noting every shift in his expression, every flicker of uncertainty when he thought no one was looking. She knew her son better than anyone, and even now, after everything that had happened, she could still sense the hesitancy in him. He was trying to believe this was real, trying to believe that John meant what he had said. Sarah's sister touched her arm lightly, drawing her attention back, asking, "You okay?" Sarah managed to smile and replied, "I think so, glancing across the room where John and Tyler were still seated at one of the tables. "It's just tonight was more than I expected." Her sister nodded knowingly, as if to say that all of them felt it too. Sarah exhaled, rubbing her arms as if trying to shake off the weight of her emotions. "I always knew Tyler struggled with this, but I didn't know how much it meant to him. Not until tonight," her sister added softly. Across the hall, a small group of guests lingered near the bar, their conversations filled with an undercurrent of reflection. Many had come expecting to witness a beautiful wedding, a celebration of love and new beginnings, but instead had found themselves part of something far more intimate, something raw and unexpected. An older man, one of John's uncles, shook his head in quiet wonder, remarking that he had never seen anything like that at a wedding before. Beside him, a woman nodded, her eyes still damp from the emotions of the night. "It was incredible. I mean, we were here for the wedding, but that was something else." Another guest, a friend of Sarah's from work, added, shaking her head as she said, "I was watching Tyler the whole time. The way he looked at John when he gave him that note. You could tell how much it took for him to do that." One of John's cousins, a tall man with a thoughtful expression, sipped his drink before saying, "Kids don't ask for something like that unless they've thought about it for a long time." A woman from Sarah's side of the family, who had been sitting close to the front during the ceremony, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue and said, "I lost it when John hugged him. I mean, you could see how much that moment meant to both him and Tyler. That boy has been carrying this for so long." The conversation drifted into quiet recollections, each person reflecting on their own impression of the moment and the weight of what they had witnessed. Sarah, standing nearby, overheard the exchange and felt her chest tighten slightly. It was her biggest fear, that Tyler would keep questioning, that he would be too afraid to let himself trust what had been offered to him. John, still sitting at the table with Tyler, seemed to sense the same thing. He hadn't pushed the boy to talk or tried to force him into conversation, but he had remained close, never straying far. He knew that tonight had changed things, even if everything had not suddenly become easy. Tyler sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze distant as he absorbed the fragments of conversation, noticing that people were not looking at him with pity, but with something softer, even though it made him uncomfortable to be the center of attention. Finally, John broke the silence by saying, "You did something really brave tonight, Tyler." For a long moment, Tyler did not respond. Then his finger tightened slightly before relaxing as he shrugged and said, "I just said what I was thinking." John gave a small smile and added, "That's not always easy." Tyler glanced up, searching John's expression for any hint of hesitation or doubt, but found only quiet certainty. After a long pause, Tyler spoke again in a softer voice. "People keep looking at me weird." John raised an eyebrow and asked, "Weird how?" Tyler hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "Like they feel sorry for me, like they think I'm different now." John considered this for a moment before replying, "I don't think they feel sorry for you. I think they're just moved by what you did." Tyler frowned slightly and murmured, "It wasn't that big of a deal." John leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and said, "Maybe not to you, but to the rest of us it was huge. You let people see you tonight, the real you, and that's not something most people can do." Tyler did not know how to respond. He had spent so long keeping everything inside, convinced that no one would understand or care, but tonight had proven him wrong. Sarah then approached the table, her eyes warm as she looked between John and Tyler, and asked, "Are you two okay?" Tyler nodded with a small movement, and John glanced at Sarah before returning his gaze to Tyler, saying, "We're good." Sarah studied her son for a moment longer before sitting down beside him, reaching over to smooth a hand over his hair. He stiffened slightly at first, then allowed her touch. As guests continued to filter out, leaving behind only close family and a few lingering friends, the hall grew quieter and the energy more subdued. The night was coming to an end, yet Tyler knew that this was just the beginning of something else. John stood and stretched, then glanced at Tyler, offering him a small but knowing smile as he said, "Come on, let's go home." That word, home, settled warmly in Tyler's chest, a feeling both warm and unfamiliar that for the first time in a long time made him feel that this was more than just a place. It was a belonging. Outside, the night air was crisp as they stepped out of the reception hall, the warmth of the celebration still lingering in the glow of streetlights. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a few cars remaining as the last of the guests said their final goodbyes. Sarah walked ahead, speaking quietly with her sister one last time before they parted ways, while John and Tyler followed at a slower pace, their steps unhurried, as if neither was quite ready for the night to end. Tyler stuffed his hands into the pockets of his suit jacket, his fingers curling around the fabric as his thoughts grew quieter, less frantic than before. There was no more room for doubt after everything that had happened, yet there was still something unfamiliar about this feeling, this sense of belonging that felt too big to fit inside his chest. John glanced down at him as they walked, saying nothing at first, having given Tyler space all night to process things at his own pace. But now he could tell that the boy was caught in his own head. "You tired?" John finally asked. Tyler hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah." Sarah turned slightly in her seat to look at him and asked, "Are you sure?" Tyler met her gaze for a moment before looking down at his hands, unsure how to express what he was feeling, how to put it into words that made sense. He wasn't used to having people care enough to notice when something was on his mind, but then he thought about the note, the way John had answered him without hesitation, and the way he had held him when he finally allowed himself to break without pulling away or pretending to be okay. Tyler shifted slightly and said, "I think it's just weird." Sarah tilted her head and asked, "What is?" Tyler hesitated again, the words hanging in the air for a moment as he considered that he was no longer alone. Then John's grip on the steering wheel tightened just slightly before relaxing, and in a quiet, steady voice he said, "You were never alone, Tyler." Those words made something deep inside Tyler ache in a way he couldn't quite explain, and Sarah reached back to rest her hand on his knee for a brief moment before pulling away gently, saying, "We're here now, and we're not going anywhere." The rest of the car ride was quiet. Not a heavy silence, but a quiet filled with understanding and unspoken truth. By the time they pulled into the driveway of their home, the exhaustion of the night had finally caught up with Tyler. He let out a quiet breath as John parked the car and unbuckled his seatbelt, making no move to get out just yet. Sarah stepped out first, stretching slightly before making her way to the front door, while John waited, glancing back at Tyler, who was still sitting in the back seat. "You coming?" John asked. Tyler hesitated for a second, then nodded, pushing the car door open and stepping out into the cooler night air, which felt quieter than the city. The house stood in front of him with warm light spilling from the windows, making it feel less like just a building and more like home. A place that, although he had lived there for years, had never quite felt like home until now. He followed John inside, kicking off his shoes at the door and watching as Sarah disappeared into the bedroom to change out of her dress. John loosened his tie and sighed as he ran a hand through his hair. The house was quiet, the weight of the evening settling over them like a soft blanket. Tyler lingered near the entrance, suddenly unsure of what to do with himself after such a long night and all the emotions that still felt tangled. Yet there was a strange sense of peace in knowing he was here, that this was real, and that John had meant everything he said. John noticed Tyler's hesitation and, wanting him to sit for a bit, motioned toward the couch. Tyler hesitated for only a second before nodding and following John into the living room, where they sat on the far end of the couch. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of a lamp casting gentle shadows along the walls, and for a while they sat in silence without any rush to fill it. After a long pause, Tyler finally spoke. "You're really going to do it, huh?" John turned to look at him, his expression briefly unreadable before he nodded and said, "Yeah, I am." Tyler swallowed and asked, "You're not just saying that because of the wedding, right?" John's expression softened further as he replied, "No, I mean it." Tyler looked down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting as he picked at the hem of his shirt. He wanted to believe, he truly did, but a part of him still felt as though he was waiting for something to go wrong. John understood that without Tyler having to say it, and said, "I know this isn't something you can just believe overnight." Tyler exhaled slowly, and though they sat in silence again, it felt easier this time. John then reached into his pocket, pulled out a small folded piece of paper, held it between his fingers for a moment, and then handed it to Tyler. Tyler frowned as he took it hesitantly, and when he unfolded it, his breath caught in his throat. It was his note. "Please adopt me." The words staring back at him, familiar and heavy, but this time not feeling as scary. John nodded toward it and said, "I'm keeping that," simply adding "forever." For the first time in a long time, Tyler's fingers tightened around the paper, and he felt that maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to keep waiting for things to fall apart. That maybe this time they wouldn't. And as he sat there holding the note that had changed everything, he finally allowed himself to believe that they were a family now, and that nothing was going to change that. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones, share this video with your friends, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you want more, check out the other videos on the channel.